Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence, Virtual Training GRPs and TBT, Part 2 of 3. My name is Kim Pittenger with AdvaMed, and I will be today's webinar facilitator along with my AdvaMed colleagues. Before we get started, I'd like to announce some housekeeping items. Each participant is in listen-only mode, meaning that your line is currently muted. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Please type your questions in the question/chat function within your GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Please also note this presentation is being recorded. Many webinar platforms have experienced an influx of use in recent months, so should you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, first attempt to exit the broadcast and rejoin. There is a link to a general troubleshooting guide in the chat box as well. If any of the panelists experience audio or technical difficulties, please let us know using the chat function. Lastly, today's webinar recording and the presenter's slides will be available to attendees within 24 hours of the conclusion of the broadcast at www.interamericancoalition-medtech.org. This concludes the housekeeping portion of our webinar. It is my pleasure to turn it over to Sandra Gonzalez to get us started.
Thank you, Kim. Good morning, everyone. This is Sandra Gonzalez, Executive Secretary for the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence in Medical Technology Sector. Welcome, and thank you for joining to the second webinar on good regulatory practices and technical barriers to trade. Today, we are pleased to have Janet Tronso, Senior Vice President, Technology and Regulatory Affairs at AdvaMed and Chair for the Regulatory Committee for the Global Medical Technology Association, who is going to be walking us through a thorough overview of the Gmta regulatory priorities. What is the view of AdvaMed of the USMD regulatory policies, including MEDUFA and the 21st Century Cures list Burdensome? She's going to be also walking us through the Aipac curriculum and some suggestions for our coalition prioritization. After that, we will have a Q&A session, and we will continue going through the good regulatory practices and international benchmarks that Renata Amaral is going to be introducing us to. She's going to be reviewing OECD, IDB, ABD, and APEC. She's going to be walking us through the primary elements of GRP, including CROBs, and of course, advancing opportunities for GRP from the COVID-19 pandemic. We're going to be following up again with the Q&A session, and we're going to be closing with some remarks out of what we will be sharing during this time all together. So thank you so much. Janet, thank you for accepting our invitation, and we are ready for you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about some regulatory priorities that we are dealing with in the past few years. I'm also going to discuss a little bit about what we're dealing with now in the future, or in the present with the COVID pandemic. I'll talk a little bit about the Gmta regulatory priorities, a little bit about the US regulatory policies, specifically on the medical device user fee commitments. And I'll tell you why that's kind of an important topic at this point in the program, and the application of some of the key provisions in the 21st Century Cures legislation. Although it passed a few years ago, we are still implementing some of those provisions, especially around least burdensome. The APEC medical device priority work area that just was established about a little over a year ago. And then I'll talk about the COVID-19 activities that are in place right now in the US FDA regulatory system. It's kind of an interesting regulatory program that FDA has put into place to deal with this, and I think it's an important feature to understand, because I think we can learn from these streamlined regulatory approaches. And finally, a little bit of a few recommendations based on some of the information that I'm going to present. So, Erin, the next slide. So first we'll talk about the Global Medical Technology Alliance, the GMTA. We refer a lot to the GMTA. The GMTA is an alliance of medical device trade associations from around the world. And we've been in existence for many years at this point, and we continue to grow as we initially started out with the 2 trade associations that are agreeing to chair it. The group is actually chaired by MedTech Europe and AvaMed, and it's been in existence for a while. Most recently, the group, one of the reasons why the group, this alliance is so important is because we were able to get the status of an NGO with the World Health Organization. The GMTA itself decided a few years ago that we needed to have a regulatory committee since much of the work that we do relates to regulatory activities. And when that GMTA regulatory committee was established, the group nominated myself as chair, so I chair that regulatory group. I'm getting a lot of background noise on this call. Are you?
Hi, Janet, this is Kim. I am hearing that background noise. It could be an echo coming from your own computer. You might want to try first just turning the computer volume on your machine down a couple notches and see if that solves the issue.
Okay. All right, I will continue on. I apologize for that interference. So from the perspective of the GMTA Regulatory Committee, this is what I will continue to speak about, not the entire GMTA organization. Okay, I will. Any other recommendations, Kim, to get rid of this background noise?
We might attempt having you exit the broadcast and rejoin. It's not as significant on my end, but I am hearing that echo. So you might just want to try and exit and rejoin, and we can just press pause for about 30 seconds.
Okay. Should I join by phone instead?
Yeah, you're certainly welcome to try that. You can do that from the audio drop down in your control panel and switch to phone call and just dial the number that appears when you select that. And we appreciate everyone's patience as we route these technical difficulties. If you have any questions so far, we encourage you to put those in the chat. I've seen some questions coming through about the presentation slides so far. While Janet is switching to her phone audio, a reminder that today's webinar recording and slides will be available to attendees within 24 hours at www.interamericancoalition-medtech.org. Okay, Janet, I'm seeing your audio is coming through. Can you go ahead and speak into your phone?
Yes, can you hear me?
Wonderful, that sounds much better.
Great.
Excellent,
Okay.
We thank you for your patience.
Great. So the next, so under the GMTA regulatory priorities, for the past several years, we have focused on the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, the IMGRF. And the reason why is that the IMDRF has extended a status to the GMTA in the sense that we are asked to sit as an observer during the management committee session of the IMDRF meeting. We are asked to present at the IMDRF stakeholder session, which is a session that they hold in conjunction with the biannual or semi-annual meetings of the IMDRF. We have used that opportunity to present a series of positions. And just to give you an example of some of the positions that we have submitted and presented to the IMDRF. First and foremost, I'll start with the topic of regulatory convergence. We have felt that over the years, even though the IMDRF issues guidance documents that consist of a harmonized regulatory approach, we have observed inconsistent implementation of those guidance documents. So we have, in a few of our presentations, have focused on the topic of the importance of regulatory convergence. So that's kind of the high-level topic. The second area that we have focused on is we have conveyed to the IMDRF a series of regulatory positions that we have taken on certain areas. So, for example, we developed principles related to the topic of real-world evidence and use of real-world evidence. We, when we get an approval from the GMTA, all of those associations that comprise the GMTA, when we get an approval of a position that we have taken, and we've done it mostly in the context of principles. So we've got one on principles of related to cybersecurity, principles, as I said, related to regulatory convergence, principles related to clinical data transparency. So any of these principles that we have received approval of, we have conveyed those principles at one of our sessions during the course of the GMTA being permitted to make a presentation. So that is how we have used the IMDRF meetings as a mechanism to convey the work of the GMTA Regulatory Committee. We have found that there are other ways in which we can influence regulatory work under the IMDRF. And we have identified the GMTA regulatory experts in certain fields to represent the GMTA on the working groups that are established by the IMDRF Management Committee. In many cases, we are permitted to have a industry expert on the working group. However, there are some working groups for which the IMDRF has decided that there will be no industry representation. But when we can, we assign someone. I'll give you the latest example. The IMDRF, about a year ago, established a working group that was to address the classification principles for in vitro diagnostics. This work had already been done under the GHDF, and a guidance document was approved many, many years ago under the Global Harmonization Task Force, which no longer exists. The work of the idea was to update that guidance document, and we were able to get some of our in vitro diagnostic experts represented on that working group, and we expect the product of their work to be issued soon. We also, the third way in which we present information to IMDRF is to submit comments on guidance documents that are published for a comment period. The other organization that recognizes the GMTA is the World Health Organization. They will accept comments on proposals or documents. They invite the GMTA to provide those comments because we have recognition from the World Health Organization as a NGO status, which gives us the ability to do the comments and opportunities for the World Health Organization to look at those and accept them. They have asked us to participate in the World Medical Device Forum. This is not an annual event. It seems to average every 2 to 3 years. And of course, this year, we're not seeing these kind of events because of the COVID pandemic. The next slide. Now I'm going to switch to some of the regulatory policies within the United States. And I was suggested to talk a little bit about the medical device user fee commitment. But maybe I should explain what the medical device user fee program is. Back in 2002, the industry and the US FDA reached an agreement where the US industry would pay application fees, and in exchange for those application fees, FDA would commit to performance metrics. These programs are 5-year programs. So in 2002, it was the first time we had what we called a user fee program. This gets enacted into the law, and so it's a very official program, and FDA is committed to meeting those commitments. The funding that is provided by the industry through these fees is used to support the addition of reviewers and reviewer resources to meet those commitments. They're 5-year programs, so we're currently in the 4th user fee program. And every time we negotiated the new user fee program, we got a little better about it. We understood the deficiencies in some of the ways in which the program was constructed, so we adjusted accordingly. But there are some basic premises within a user fee program that remain the same. And those are performance metrics for decisions on the submissions. So for each submission type, FDA is committed to providing a decision for mostly it's around 90% of the submissions. So there is a little wiggle room for some of those problematic submissions. So we didn't focus entirely on performance metrics. We wanted to make some of the processes within the review program to be a little better, a little more efficient, a little more predictable, and a little more transparent. So we worked on the review process from the beginning to the end. So the pre-submission review process is a program by which a company can submit a request to the agency to receive information on the types of data and what FDA's expectations are for certain product type submission. It's really a way to get clarity from the agency as to what is needed so that a company doesn't develop the wrong type of data and then not get its submission approved. So the pre-submission review process has some metrics around how long it would take to get the feedback from FDA, to establish a meeting date, if a meeting, some type of meeting, whether it's teleconference or in person. That whole program has process around it that we committed to through the user fee negotiation. Then once you file your submission, there is a interaction that occurs midway in the review process. This substantive, we call it a substantive interaction. It's one in which the reviewer tells the company, hey, everything is good, you're on track, you'll get your submission decision within the time frame. Or that substantive interaction could be a request for additional information that the reviewer might need to make the decision. But you're guaranteed that you're going to get something midway in the review process from the reviewer, which is really an important and predictable step in the review process. And then finally, if you have a submission that FDA reviewer had some difficulty with and you didn't get your decision at the prescribed time that was required for a decision, the reviewer, there is a program what we call No Submission Left Behind, which the reviewer and the company have a conversation, teleconversation or meeting to figure out what needs to be done to get that submission finalized. Next slide. So there were some other user fee commitments that were not so performance metric kind of provisions. There were programs around digital health, patient engagement, third-party review program, which is a program that really is important from an international regulatory convergence approach. It's not a program that is widely used in our U.S. regulatory system. There was a conformity assessment pilot, guidance document development, and then using real-world evidence to support pre-market submissions. All of these, what I call more of the qualitative performance that is part of the user fee agreement, are all areas that we have been tracking with FDA on an ongoing basis throughout this program because they are important to the industry. The next slide. The 21st century cures. There were some really important provisions in 21st century cures, even though it was legislation that was passed about three years ago. This legislation had some device-related provisions that I would say are really important as we talk about regulatory convergence. The first was establishing some firm procedural program around the review of medical devices that have been designated as breakthrough. These are medical devices that meet a definition of meeting an unmet clinical need or providing a therapy or diagnostic that is superior to what is currently on the market, or the FDA may believe that the technology is one that is really important overall to the public health. If a company gets this breakthrough pathway designation for its product application, there are a lot of interactions between the reviewers and the company throughout the process, the purpose of which is to ensure that the breakthrough products get a streamlined review so that they can get into the hands of healthcare providers and patients as quickly as possible. So that program has been working really well at FDA. FDA has many products that are designated in this program. And these are medical devices that FDA has never reviewed before. So you can imagine the challenge that occurs with this and the importance of the company and the reviewer to work closely together, meeting often and working through any issues. The second part of 21st century cures that I think is really an important part of any regulatory system is the exemption of low-risk device types from a review process. You know, in the world of medical devices, because we have so many varieties of medical devices, from the lowest risk to the very complex medical devices, you can't apply a one type of regulatory system for each and every type of device. The requirements should really be commensurate with the risk posed by the medical device itself. So we always believe that the lowest risk medical devices, those class 1 low risk medical devices and many of the class 2 category, should be exempt from a submission to FDA. It doesn't mean that those products are exempt from meeting quality system requirements, or they're exempt from reporting adverse events to the regulatory agency. But at the end of the day, they should not have this regulatory oversight that is not commensurate with the low risk that these medical devices present. So there were over 1,000 different device types that were exempt from a submission as a result of this legislation, which is an impressive number. The third area, and this one is still ongoing, it was an application of least burdensome principles. FDA was instructed through this legislation to improve the least burdensome provisions of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, because these provisions have been in place since 1997. And FDA's implementation of the least burdensome principles has been sporadic. And so this legislation in 21st Century Cures had some very definitive actions that FDA had to take. One is that they had to report to Congress how they're implementing the provisions. FDA, soon after the legislation was passed, did a survey among the industry members asking specific questions related to 21st century, related to least burdensome, and provided a report to Congress. And FDA is now in the middle of a second survey on least burdensome, asking the very same questions 2 years later, so that FDA can report to Congress whether their implementation of least burdensome remains the same, is it better, or is it worse? So that's what's going on that legislation. Next slide. So I'll mention a little bit about Aipac. For the first time, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation has a regulatory harmonization steering committee. But in late 2018, for the first time, this committee looked at medical devices. It was mostly focused on pharmaceutical products. So a medical device priority work area was established. And what that means is that under their rules of the Regulatory Harmonization Steering Committee, work areas established, educational institutions become centers of excellence where they provide training in the area, in this case, medical device regulation. This work area was established under the provision that the core curriculum for these training programs would be based on the harmonized regulatory model that was, of course, based on the old GHCF guidance documents that are still in practice, and any IMDRF documents. And it's a three-pronged approach. It's a pre-market, post-market, and quality system program. The first Center of Excellence provided pilot training and then eventually got approved in 2019. And there are 6 other centers of excellence that are in a pilot training process right now. So once they demonstrate to the committee that they can conduct this training, then those centers of excellence become approved as a center of excellence for the medical device work area. That is ongoing work, but it's a significant step towards regulatory harmonization. Next slide. So I was asked to provide a quick overview of some of the emergency use authorizations and the changes in the FDA review process as they relate to what has FDA done to address the COVID-19 pandemic. And there is a provision within the law that allows for FDA during a pandemic to issue emergency use authorizations to products that are necessary to address the pandemic. And this is a major effort on the part of FDA. We've never seen a pandemic like this before, so the number of emergency use authorization applications that FDA is receiving is significant. The first type of product that was necessary for addressing the pandemic is to have a diagnostic test. And those are being approved and distributed based on the emergency use authorization. At the point of time in which I prepared these slides, there were over 100 tests that were authorized. And these are all publicly available on the FDA website. If you go into this part of the website where they talk about the COVID activities, you'll see a listing of all the various types of tests that and who the manufacturer is and what they're approved for. The second area of devices that became absolutely essential during the emergency were the use of ventilators. You've probably heard about ventilator shortages being reported. FDA has, for one example, FDA had 300 submission requests, and these also include pre-submissions in a 3-week period just around the ventilators. And many ventilators have been approved through the emergency use authorization program to address the shortages. And then the third area, of course, is personal protective equipment, masks, face shields, respirators, gowns, gloves. All of these were products that FDA needed to address to ensure that there was an adequate supply available for the healthcare providers in the country. FDA also instituted a series of changes in the review process. They practiced some enforcement discretion policies. These were typically around products that might have an additional indication for use, and FDA allowed those. FDA had to do something with its review resources. FDA has a lot of review resources, but they had to redeploy people. They had to take reviewers from some divisions that did not have a number of applications related to products like ventilators, and they had to bring reviewers from other review divisions into the divisions that were overwhelmed with applications. So reviewers were coming from, say, the orthopedics division to help with review of some of the other products in some of the other areas. But it was a redeployment within their own review offices to address the needs, because it's just an overwhelming number of submissions. FDA also issued statements that they can no longer, of course, meet in person. A lot of these pre-submission meetings that I talked about earlier were done in person with FDA reviewers, statisticians, and clinicians. And in this case, all of those meetings are done virtually and through June, probably going into July at this point. Next slide. So the final set of information that I'm providing here is really taking all of the information that I've discussed so far and thinking about what are some recommendations to prioritize and promote regulatory convergence. And we'll start off with the importance of implementing a consistent regulatory model. And that model is really the harmonized regulatory model is represented by the GHTF guidance documents and the IMGRF guidance documents. If there were implementation of those, that would be a major step towards regulatory convergence. And when I say implementation, I mean consistent implementation rather than interpretation that is different. And that's why the importance of regulator training programs is so important. I think the Aipac program provides a real opportunity to get that regulatory training on the model, the harmonized regulatory model, done in a consistent way. And that's why Aipac has been very, the regulators comprising the Regulatory Harmonization Steering Committee are very firm about these regulatory training programs for medical devices to follow that core curriculum, which is based on these guidance documents. We've also talked to IMGRF about training programs and their support of them. The adoption of international consensus standards, I think that's an easy one. And reliance on regulatory decisions. And the MDSAP program under the IMGRF is a good example of relying on those regulatory decisions from the MDSAP program is a good way to conserve resources of the regulator and to get comfortable with that reliance kind of program. And the next slide. I think I talked about this during this presentation about the importance of regulatory systems, and that's why we were so supportive of the user fee program, because the user fee program provided for the U.S. regulatory system predictability. A company could know when they might expect a decision on their submission. They would know when they might get that midway interaction from the reviewer on whether the submission is meeting the expectations or not. And so the importance of predictability in a regulatory system is a priority, and there are ways to accomplish that, user fee program being one. There has to be transparency. You need to know what the requirements are. And non-value added work should not be part of a regulatory system. It should be efficient. You can get that efficiency in some ways by the reliance on other decisions from trusted partners. And what we found with the pandemic is the importance of a regulatory system to be flexible. Without that flexibility, the FDA did business as it usually did during the pandemic. The diagnostic tests, the additional ventilators, the personal protective equipment would not be available. It has to be flexible to address the needs. That's why Breakthrough Technology Program, I consider that a flexible program. It's a way in which you can get a technology onto the market, into the hands of patients and healthcare providers. And the ability of the regulator to streamline approvals for critical devices necessary in a pandemic emergency. This is all the act of a flexible regulatory system. I gave a talk about flexible regulatory systems and the importance of that about 10 years ago at an international meeting. And I reflected on that conversation or that talk when the pandemic arrived. And I thought, wow, if there is not a better time than now to have a flexible regulatory system, I don't know when it is, but the importance of it is so much more emphasized in the times that we're in right now. So those are one of my recommendations, and I'm going to conclude my presentation at this point.
Thank you, Janet. I think we have a couple of minutes to go over some of the questions that have been raised by our audience. So we appreciate if we can go over them.
Okay. So the first question that we have is from Fernanda Garcia Castro. How does FDA classify the products and which of them are considered low risk? FDA has a classification of a program where it looks at a variety of factors to classify. Now, for the vast majority of medical devices, they've already been classified. They've been classified since the first year of medical device regulation that was established back in 1976. So the FDA system is a three-class system. So the classification occurred back then. But FDA also has a system in place that not only, you had that original classification of thousands and thousands of medical device types back in 1976. It doesn't mean that that classification is the same today. And the reason why is that FDA looked at reclassification processes. And that's a key regulatory procedure because sometimes over time, the product that you might have thought was a high-risk product that after decades and decades of use and safe and effective use without a lot of adverse events associated with its use, you start to look at those products and maybe realize that the highest risk classification may no longer be applicable. So there are reclassification processes in place. And when I talked about the 21st century cures, that it gave FDA the authority to go back and look at low risk products and say that these no longer require submission. It was an easy administrative procedure that FDA had to go through just to do that. And it's because those low risk products may no longer be why would you waste FDA resources reviewing submissions for those very low risk class 1? I can tell you from the current situation is most class 1 products, there's just about less than a handful that no longer require submissions. And that is a good step forward. And then the bulk of products are in the moderate risk category, and then you have the high risk products that are smaller grouping. So the next question, thank you for that question. So the next question is from Renata Silva regarding the Gmta actions related to regulatory convergence. Is there any initiative in place to influence, educate directly Latin American authorities? I guess the question is, are there initiatives based on from the Gmta? We have Latin American trade associations part of Gmta. We have not educated any groups directly from Gmta. We just recommend to any group that we, any international group that we recommend training based on the GHTF and IMDRF guidance documents. It's a recommendation. It's not a specific initiative. The next question is a political question, and I'm not equipped to answer it, but I will state the question because it could be, and it's for the entire panel, not just for me. So I'll just say that the question that has been asked is, do you foresee any negative impact in our sector from the decision of the United States to exit the World Health Organization? I think it's too early to tell, but it will be, it's certainly a political question that I'm sure we'll deliberate on internally should this continue, but I don't know if Stephen has any views on that one.
I wouldn't add anything at this point.
Right. Yeah. That was the final question. Shall I turn it over to the next, to Sandra?
Yes, Janet, really thank you very much for all your insights. And we're continuing with our program. And I'm very pleased to introduce Renata Amaral. She holds a PhD in International Trade Law. She is the director for the summer program on WTO and U.S. trade law at the American University Washington College of Law, and an international trade scholar for trade, investment, and development program. She's a member of the board of the ABCI Institute, Brazilian International Trade Scholars, a nonprofit organization headquartered in Washington, D.C., which is involved in the organization of trade-related events in Brazil. And last but not least, she's a member of the technical secretariat of the coalition with focus on GRPs and TBTs. Renata, thank you for accepting our invitation, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for the introduction. Thank you, Janet, for the excellent presentation. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. My presentation will be on good regulatory practices. So we decided to deliver to you a very introductory presentation on GRPs, what is happening around the world, what is central for this coalition, and next week we will continue this presentation on with technical barriers to trade agreement from the World Trade Organization. So it is central for our coalition the implementation of foundational cross-sectorial good regulatory practices that can be institutionalized as a whole of government regulatory approaches, and remove limits to sector-specific regulatory convergence efforts. So what are good regulatory practices, also referred as GRPs or good regulatory design and regulatory coherence? They speak to the quality and consistency of the domestic rulemaking process. It refers to the internal coordination and review process under which the whole of government works to ensure that rules and regulations are crafted in an open, transparent, and participatory manner, and that outcomes are risk-based and grounded in the best available data. Next slide, please. So there are three things to remember when we start talking about good regulatory practice. First, GRPs aren't about more regulation or less regulation. They are about facilitating better regulatory outcomes. Political processes make directional decisions, but GRPs create a professional process to rulemaking that follows the political course set. They achieve this by adhering to the
a transparent and participatory rulemaking process and to evidence-based decision-making. Good regulatory practices are an important precursor to regulatory cooperation. Only quality regulatory outcomes avail themselves of regulatory cooperation opportunities. So good regulatory practices basically ensure that rules and regulations are crafted in a very open manner and horizontal manner across regulators. We can go to the next slide, please. So quality regulatory policy is based on codifying good regulatory practices. The internationally recognized processes, systems, tools, and methods used to ensure the quality, transparency, and inclusive development of regulation. The key elements for GRP, in our view, the coalition view, include the ones that are highlighted above from the 13 elements for good regulatory practice. I'm going to read them all, and then I'll highlight the ones that we understand the most important for you to remember. So, elements for good regulatory practice. First, issue a regulatory forecast. Have a national regulatory register. Provide opportunity for public comment. Publish evidence and conduct regulatory analysis. Respond to stakeholder input. Use quality data and sound sciences. Employ risk-based approaches. Conduct regulatory impact assessments. Conduct pro-competitive analysis. Assess the international impact of a regulation. Use international standards as a basis for national regulations. Conduct ex-post assessments of regulatory impacts. Establish a central regulatory oversight body. From the above, all of them are important in the process of conducting good regulatory practice internally in each of our countries and internationally. It's very, very key to provide opportunity for public comment, use quality data and sound science, regulatory impact assessments, and access the international impact of a regulation, and use international standards as a base for national regulations where the international standards exist. We can move to the following slide, please. So, good regulatory practice encompassing the use of regulatory impact assessments, stakeholder engagements, and ex-post evaluation are critical tools in the hands of governments to ensure that regulation achieves its objectives. Over the past several years, attention has grown for the trade costs of regulatory divergence. Diverging regulation may increase the costs of trade goods and services across borders. And here, I would like to spend a little bit more time. It's important for us to remember that unnecessary regulatory differences can impose costs that prevent businesses from engaging in trade. As we are going to further discuss next week, the TBT agreement, as well as the SPS agreement, so the Technical Barriers to Trade agreement, and the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement from the World Trade Organization. According to them, members are encouraged to use relevant international standards as the basis for their measures, including disciplines on equivalence and recognition of foreign conformity assessment, which help to ensure that traders do not face duplicative requirements or procedures when regulations differ across markets. These disciplines encourage the reduction of regulatory diversity and associated trade costs. International regulatory cooperation between members can help reduce trade costs while respecting differences in regulatory objectives. This cooperation may take several forms and depths of engagement, many of which are directly relevant to trade outcomes. We are going to talk more about that and the role of the World Trade Organization next week. Now I'd like to provide an overview of the work of important multilateral stakeholders on good regulatory practices, starting with the OECD. The next slide, please. Thank you. So the OECD guidelines for good regulatory practice are a starting point for good regulatory talks. The 2012 OECD recommendation highlights a number of principles and tools that can help policymakers develop, implement, and update regulations that promote their policy goals in the public interest. The recommendation recognizes the importance of international regulatory cooperation for regulatory quality and the relevance of the tools of regulatory policy, encompassing ex-ante regulatory impact assessment, stakeholder engagement, and ex-post evaluation to base regulatory policy making on evidence, including the evaluation of the likely benefits, costs, and effects of regulation and the consideration of the voice of the regulated. Something important to highlight here is that the 2012 recommendation of the Council on Regulatory Policy and Governance recognizes that an effective regulatory policy includes a consistent policy covering the whole of functions of regulatory agencies in order to provide greater confidence that regulatory decisions are made on an objective, impartial, and consistent basis without conflict of interest, bias, or improper influence. We can move to the next slide to talk about AIPAC. So AIPAC, you all know, is the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, and we find it important to highlight the AIPAC actions for the medical devices sector, because it's something that we can maybe mirror the work of our coalition. The AIPAC Life Sciences Innovation Forum and its Regulatory Harmonization Steering Committee adopted in 2010, 10 years ago, its strategic plan called Vision 2020, a strategic framework regulatory convergence for medical products by 2020. This strategic plan provided the basic proposal and rationale for achieving regional regulatory convergence of medical product approval procedures. While each AIPAC member economy adopted each phase of its own timeframe, the ultimate aim is for AIPAC economies to achieve as much regulatory convergence as possible by 2020. So the purpose of the strategic framework is to outline a strategic multi-year approach for meeting this objective in support of the broader objectives of improved public health and economic development. We can move to the next slide to talk a little bit about the work of the IDB and the American Business Dialogue. I would like to just highlight that all this material I'm mentioning from OECD, from WTO, from AIPAC, now from IDB is available online at the websites of each organization. So according to the policy recommendations and 2018-2021 Action Plan for Growth in the Americas, regulatory processes should be transparent for all stakeholders, encourage public consultation and participation, and be based on scientific analysis and clear evidence of regulatory impacts, thus increasing the legitimacy of the entire regulatory process. While some progress has been made to codify good regulatory practice and establish central regulatory oversight bodies in the Americas, region-wide uptake of these measures remains far from fully realized. I would like just to spend a little bit more time on central regulatory oversight bodies before we move to the next slide. So central regulatory oversight bodies have been key pieces in the process of regulatory reform, working as engineers of reform, maintaining a whole strategic point of view, coordinating inside the administration. Oversight bodies' general role, besides supervision, control, and coordination, consists in forcing regulators to demonstrate and justify the relevance of their regulation, potential and existing, using accountability and assessment mechanisms, as well as offering them advice and promoting regulatory reform throughout government whilst guaranteeing regulatory quality. Appropriate institutional arrangements have been recognized as essential components of a comprehensive strategy for regulatory reform. We can move to the next slide, please. So to close my remarks on good regulatory practice, we brought here the good regulatory practice chapter in the recent approved Usmca agreement between Canada, United States, and Mexico. Why am I bringing this chapter? In our view, the US-Mexico-Canada chapter on good regulatory practice represents the state of the art in terms of what we have codified on GRP in a trade agreement. We view the GRP provisions included in the USMCA chapter as a positive evolution based on the previous regulatory coherence of the TPP agreement and the CPTPP. We can talk about this next week a little bit further, the trade agreements, which was in turn an evolution of the regulatory reform work with the Aipac OECD integrated checklist. Important to highlight here the benefit for industry of the USMCA sector annex on medical devices, and specifically the outcome of the Medical Device Single Audit Program, MDSAP, of medical device manufacturers being accepted in several Western Hemisphere members, US, Canada, Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico soon to be. The annex also includes obligations that formalize, codify on best regulatory practice in the medical device sector. So here, I listed here in this slide the sub-chapters of the good regulatory practice chapter of the USMCA agreement. We can just briefly read the sub-chapters, so you have this in mind. I think this is very important because this is really the state of the art of a chapter in a trade agreement, and this is very important for all of our countries. So it establishes a central regulatory coordinated body, also called Central Regulatory Oversight Body, establish internal consultation, coordination and review, information quality, early planning, dedicated website, use of plain language, transparent development of regulations, expert advisory groups, regulatory impact assessment, final publication, retrospective review, suggestions for improvement, information about regulatory process, annual report, encouragement of regulatory compatibility and cooperation, Committee on Good Regulatory Practice, Contact Points, and Dispute Settlements. So with this, I end my presentation, my remarks for today. And I don't know if we have, I give back the floor to Sandra. I don't know if we have questions, Sandra.
Yes, Renata, thank you very much for your sharing. We have a question from Elizabeth George, and this is kind of like a broad question that I'd like to open it for the panelists, and of course to Steve as well. And her question is, there are a number of programs that address convergence, IMDRF and Aipac, but also the Asian Harmonization Working Party, all that claim harmonization converges. How do we ensure true convergence? There is leveraging of GHTF and IMDRF processes, but too often actual implementation varies and doesn't support the great desire of one submission, one test.
Thank you, Sandra. I think Stephen wants to jump here, right, Stephen?
I'm happy to. Stephen Bibes from AdvaMed. Janet, did you want to go first?
Sure, because this question is it's such an important question, and it's certainly something that we have been thinking about at AdvaMed for some time, and our Global Harmonization Working Group at AdvaMed has thought about this. And it's very challenging because each of these groups claim to support global harmonization, which they do, but they don't. Each group represents different constituents. So for the IMDRF, we have the original, they're what now, I think 12 members of the management committee. And I know that other jurisdictions and other economies have applied to become a member of the management committee of IMDRF. The old GHTF only had five members. And then the Asian Harmonization Working Party continues. I think they changed their name to the Global Harmonization Working Party, and they continue to grow in numbers. Then you have the Aipac Regulatory Harmonization Steering Committee that just started its own medical device work area. And so you have the Latin American group. So we have a number of groups all choosing, the same, have the same goals, but when have those groups ever gotten together? Well, they did get together one time, and that was back in 2000. It was 2000. Okay. It was the year, it was one of the first years of the IMDRF where we had a session where we asked all the groups to get together and talk about this very same question. How do we coordinate? How do we achieve a singular goal? And there were a lot of ideas, but none of them ever really materialized. So I think that that's why when the Aipac group decided to establish the medical device training programs, we were very determined that they wouldn't be reinventing the wheel on regulatory positions, that they would take the core curriculum based on GHTF and IMDRF. So that was one step. But to get to where Elizabeth is suggesting, I think it's going to take a coordinated effort among the leaders of all of these organizations to talk to one another at some point in the future and figure out a way forward so that it's not different groups doing different things.
And Janet, I'll just compliment that, completely agree, but I would say a few additional things that we've built into this coalition, the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence, are a few different things. One, we're not looking to do anything in this coalition that's being done elsewhere. We're just really focusing on the Western Hemisphere, Latin America, providing all of our resources in English, Spanish, and Portuguese to make sure that we're directly addressing both the regulatory agencies and our companies and members and associations. Two, we're taking a holistic approach in that we're looking at both medical device regulatory convergence, but also the more foundational good regulatory practices as Renata reviewed today. The coalition will be spending 75% of its time on our sector-specific convergence of regulation standards and conformity assessment measures, but we're also working with the central regulatory oversight or coordination bodies on the implementation of foundational good regulatory practices, because our sectoral convergence efforts are limited unless the governments working as a whole have implemented GRP policies and have this central regulatory oversight body. We're also working multilaterally. I know some of the other groups do this as well, but we are very much in connection with the Pan American Health Organization, but also the Inter-American Development Bank on the GRP aspects, on the trade aspects, and also working with Aipac for the overlap of the kind of west coast of South America. We're also employing a mechanism of both leading with the regulatory co-op, the information sharing, the capacity building, and all of those elements on, the WHO model regulatory framework and the OECD guidelines for GRP. However, we are also looking at the trade obligations, as Renata alluded to and will expand upon next week. The health authorities have the recommendations of the WHO for the model regulatory framework, but there's also the existing treaty-based obligations, both international, regional, and bilateral, of the medical device regulators to use international standards as a basis for regulations. So maybe you could call it incentive, disincentive, carrot and stick, but you've got the two aspects that we think this will be a unique model that the other groups can employ, and this can help all the governments really implement, address the health angle as well as the trade angle. And I would say we're also doing training. We're in the process of getting the coalition off the ground now, providing the policy context into which the coalition will be working. In its meeting on July 1, the coalition will be ratifying its priority list of issues. But then for each issue, we will have a brief identified regulatory non-alignment in the Western Hemisphere. We will have a brief summary description of the issue, a detailed description of the issue, the links to the regulations and standards that are problematic, that are causing the problem. We will have the consensus position of the coalition on what we recommend be the solution, including the reference to international standards that should be the basis to provide the desired regulatory convergence. When possible, we will try to include the economic and health impacts of the current situation and how things can be resolved with the new with the implementation of the consensus position, and then we provide everything in English and Spanish and as needed Portuguese, and we'll be sharing that information on the coalition website, not only with the medical device regulators, but also with the trade authorities, and they can work together to really push along resolution of the issue. I would also add one additional item as we highlighted in the first session last week, and that traditionally our regulatory convergence efforts have focused on the medical device agencies themselves, the medical device divisions, and now we're also working with the central regulatory oversight bodies on foundational GRP. But there's really a new audience that we need to, I think, take great care to include, and that is the regulatory process teams and authorities within the medical device agencies. So, for example, if you look at like a COFEPRIS in Mexico or an ANVISA, they have different teams that are not the medical device teams that define the regulatory process. And we can spend quite a bit of time kind of whack-a-mole dealing on particular technical issues with the medical device team, but often the medical device teams in Latin America do not have the authority to change the regulatory process, to get engaged in international standardization, to use international standards. And so we can talk to, we're blue in the face, but we're really talking to the wrong people. We need to make a concerted effort, and we think this is helpful if the FDA and the other regulators in their bilateral dialogues include these folks as well, that they're talking to the medical device people and the regulatory process people so that we can just get out of the whack-a-mole mode and get into how the agency and the medical device division as a whole can more systematically and on a continuous and consistent basis be using international standards as a basis for their work and international reference documents such as those of the IMDRF. So I'll leave it there.
Stephen, thank you very much, both Janet and Stephen, for your addressing to this question that absolutely I'm pretty convinced that it is something that calls for the attention for all of the members of the coalition. So thank you very much for your inputs. And we have not received any additional questions from the attendees to the webinar. So we're going to be closing this session. We do certainly appreciate both Janet's and Renata's contributions and insights as they provide great value while the coalition is putting together its targeted action plans for 2020-2025, as they are helping us to strengthen our ability for a more comprehensive approach to tackle the challenges we face in the region. And we're talking from convergence and its own challenge, while understanding what convergence really means, to transparency in the interactions and capacities development among all relevant stakeholders. I just want to go back, and for Renata Silva's question, I would like to add that one of the goals of the coalition is actually to help implement and advance the Gmta work in Latin America. So that is something that we are certainly sure that will contribute for us to achieve our broader goals. So I just want to thank you all for your participation and your contributions through your questions, as they allow for more robust experience. We invite you to visit our website to get access to the webinar's presentations and its recording, as well as to a wealth of information on GRPs and TBTs. So without further say, have a great day and look forward to meet you all again in our next webinar to be held on June the 9th. And now I'm turning the mic back to Kim for her closing of the webinar.
Thanks, Sandra, and thank you for joining today's webinar. And an additional thank you to all of our panelists. As a reminder, today's webinar recording and slides will be available to attendees within 24 hours at www.interamericancoalition-medtech.org. Please refer to the calendar invitations sent by my colleague Erin Leahy at eleahy@advamed.org to register for the additional webinars within this series, or reference any communications sent by either Sandra or Stephen Bipes. Please also visit advamed.org/events for information on additional virtual educational offerings. Should you have any questions, comments, or feedback regarding today's presentation, we encourage you to contact us at webinar@advamed.org. Thank you again. This concludes today's presentation.